Welcome to the LSU NCBRT Preparedness podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Markle. I am a curriculum development specialist here at NCBRT, and I work in collaboration with subject matter experts to create valuable and timely training for the responder community. The National Center for Biomedical Research and Training provides mobile training to both the national and international emergency response community. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're continuing our conversation with Gregg Bird, John Dean, and Andrew Rateaver about fire preparedness in the wildland urban interface. So to start us off today, can we talk a little bit about what steps homeowners in the WUI areas can take to prepare their properties for potential wildfires in fire season?
Sure. Ashley, if you don't mind, I'll start, guys. It really starts with the homeowner's awareness of what their potential risk is, whether it be flood or, as we're talking about here in terms of wildfire, understanding what the potential risk is in that area, and then being in compliance with local codes, vegetation management, building out and maintaining that defensible space, and making sure that even the homeowner is prepared in case there is a wildfire, that they're prepared to respond to it, evacuate, taking what they need to get. What do you think, guys?
And I'll take that one, Rat. I think that goes hand in hand with public education and media initiatives. What is it? Every year in May, there's a wildfire preparedness week, right? That's publicized, and so it's early. And make it fun, make it multimodal, if you will. So as many avenues as we have to get that education and awareness and preparedness information out there, we should be taking advantage of that. And even so much during the year in the wintertime, it never hurts to drip a little bit of education and early prevention material out there.
Yeah, I think the other thing, Rat, you talked about was earlier was in the event that folks that know that they have an issue but are unable to assist as far as when it comes to clearing those properties, where can they reach out to? Who is there help out there for them? Like we talked about before, people that may be disabled or elderly, and it's bigger than they are as far as to get that work done. So what are some options for them as well?
Yeah, I agree. And like may have mentioned before in the previous episodes, Ashley, there are programs, both local, regional, state, and even federal, FireWise or community safe, fire community safe programs that provide the information, encourage you to have the meeting, give you all the kind of setup for that. And it's really based like a crime prevention program, except for it's wildland urban interface fire prevention programs. And it gets everybody, not just the individual, but a block of individuals or that particular neighborhood or community ready for wildfire.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of communities developing and practicing evacuation plans in the event of a WUI fire?
I'll take that one first. And this goes hand in hand with general overall preparedness. And part of the emergency management initiative is to make sure they key in on the current threats and hazards that affect their jurisdictions. That used to be an every other year, 5-year process of assessment. And now with the changing times, the conditions of all hazards and threats, it's really turned into a continual living process of continually cycle and evaluating that. So as you're building evacuation plans for other disasters like flooding or blizzards or mass casualty incidents or tornadoes, in areas that are susceptible to wildfires and WUI fires, as Rat has defined for us, we really need to make sure we're thinking outside the box and honing up our evacuation plans and skills and publicizing that. There's numerous instances. Gatlinburg, Tennessee was one of them, to where the published evacuation routes were overtaken by fire, and there were multiple people that were trapped in those evacuation routes. So not only publicizing, practice, and preparing, but also having those emergency contingencies based upon past and predictive fire behavior that we're all building into that plan for our citizens and visitors.
And I think it's even, Greg, you mentioned this before, but really about that planning. So when do I leave? When do I evacuate? Do I have things in place? Do I have a plan in place for my family? Because just like we talk about, it's the resident that takes care of and, clears a defensible area around their home. I think it's the same thing with evacuations. If I wait till last minute, and we've seen this in other natural disasters, right? With hurricanes, where people don't want to leave their home, and then by the time they go to leave, they can't get out. But if there's, most of these places have limited means of egress and ingress, right? So one road or two roads or whatever it may be. And just like you said, if one is impeded by, let's say, fallen trees or a disabled vehicle or anything of that, or the fire is over in that area, what's my out? So it's hard to tell a family like, hey, fire started, you ought to start thinking about leaving now, versus now it's getting much bigger. Now everyone's trying to get out at the same time. Because you talk about farm animals and stuff. If I have horses, and I've been on some fires here where the fires have moved very quickly. The homeowner is trying to get the horses, trying to get them in trailers, and those thoughts were probably, and again, not owning any animals like that, is start thinking about that. Hey, this thing's coming. Let's not wait till last minute. Let's get things going. And in the event I need to leave, I can leave. So I think that's a big part of it is thinking. Really, for me, it's let's get this thing going early. If I have to leave, I can always come back. But if I'm here and I leave late and I don't have a plan in place, now I'm stuck. Now, and I think we see that time and time again in some of these wildland fires, where people, they wait till last minute, or they think they're going to be okay, and they're not.
John, that's a perfect segue. Ashley, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump in on this. I looked at a study and a presentation by a Dr. Dennis Malai, and he says in his research that essentially it's a myth that people will get a warning notice and immediately evacuate. As a matter of fact, he says of all the animals on the earth, animals in the forest will run away from the fire, but it's only man that is going to stop, go over their back fence, check with their neighbors, check the internet, make a phone call in, check the news. And he calls that whole process milling about. And rather than actually acting on the evacuation order, we delay. And so I think, Ashley, it's important for community members and the law enforcement, fire, emergency responders, especially emergency management, excuse me, to understand that people mill, just like in the study that said that they're not going to evacuate right away. And so that pre-planning, that understanding, whatever we can do to what is it, John, make sure that there's different ways to get notification and verification of the evacuation, that this is something you need to do and do now. Not maybe evacuate, but it's what is a warning order or a voluntary evacuation. All those things should be discussed ahead of time by public safety professionals, and then issued out in a coordinated manner so community members, citizens, can understand it and then act on it rather than milling around.
Yeah. So there's also Amanda Ripley writes about denial, deliberation, decisive moment. And I think that plays right within your hand, Rat.
Yeah, the survival arc. Yeah.
Yeah, the survival arc and the decision matrix there. And part of it relies on the homeowner. We talked about the responsibility. And if you have animals, if you have pets, that's a huge deal. We know people simply won't go to a shelter because shelters won't accept their pets. And so it's a twofold process. We have to understand that there are certain families and folks in the world that there really is no difference between their dog or their cat or their other humans. They're that ingrained. I get it. We understand that. So we either have to, part of that preparedness and planning piece is make sure that we have acceptable and amount numbers of shelters that will handle that, or that we, as the public safety professionals, we have a plan for how can we acceptably either separate, log, or have a place for these pets to go. Or if they have the responsibility of having a pet, having farm animals, those other things, the onus is on them to overplan, to plan for those contingencies of, hey, maybe you need to leave earlier than the rest of everybody. If you know you're going to some other location, or you have to take care of your pets first before you take care of you or your farm animal, the onus is on you being overly prepared. Or if your neighbor doesn't have to evacuate for 24 hours, maybe you need to evacuate in 36 hours. So there's that balance of where we can message and where we can try and do, but there's also going to be those instances where we need to individually educate or provide those tools so our folks can educate themselves more.
Yeah, and I think it's also you being prepared. In other words, when they tell you, hey, it's time to leave, that's not the time to start packing your stuff. You should be ready to go. Vehicles are fueled. You're in a position, your stuff's in your vehicle, and realistically, to me it would be let's get ahead of this thing, because once they tell, like you said, is once you get that warning, if you receive the warning, now you and everyone else is trying to get into out of those areas. And if you look at, again, past fires, and if you look at the after action on Maui, right? And again, people were trying to get out and they couldn't get out. So you had people that were physically getting out of their vehicles and getting into the water as a safe place of refuge. Unfortunately, in Rat's location, you're not going to have that option, right? Because you don't have another option. So I think that's a huge deal as far as when it comes to making sure that you are ready to go. And I like I said, you see it time and time again where people do not evacuate. They're being told. You guys mentioned something before too, and that's the evacuation notices. If you look at historically, a lot of times it's one system, right? It could be reverse 911, it could be PSAs. But if you lose the communication, the ability as far as for people to page or to text or call you, what's the next? Is there something else the community has? Smaller communities may have sirens and things of that nature, but how far do they carry? Like, are there other means of communication to let people know that this is coming?
That's a great point, John, and that's part within the realm of emergency preparedness and emergency management is we educate our public on the multiple modes and the multiple methods that we're going to use to notify them during an emergency. And we're also, in our messaging, we're tasked, and we should be encouraging them of have multiple ways to receive. If your electric's out, have a battery backup radio. If your phone dies or goes bad, have some other method that in these selection of ways that we're going to notify you, have 2 or 3 methods in order so you can know. But as us switching back to our responsibilities and our being real about it, we also have to recognize the fact that there is a select percentage of population, of visitors, of tourists, of whoever, that simply just aren't ready, aren't able to, and don't prepare. And so if there's some way we can go further down the line, then we need to help prepare for those challenges that we're going to face when it's crunch time, when it's the 11th hour.
Thank you. So can you discuss a little bit more about the role of emergency services and local governments in ensuring community preparedness in WUI fires?
Well, there's the innate responsibility if a WUI fire or a wildfire is within your hazard or a threat that affects your community, it has to be a part of your public education piece. There has to be a plan to educate, to prepare, to get something. And if not, you're just as guilty as the official as the person who chooses not to create that defensible space or not to know the threats and hazards we're moving into. So we have to be on our game and recognize that it can't just be one agency. It needs to be from the fire department to the emergency management piece to fire prevention, education. We need to put this in our schools. Our schools need to be pushing out this information. Just there's numerous features, but we all learn stop, drop, and roll. Why don't we have some of these other defensible space, run, hide, fight? Why aren't we ingraining these mnemonics and starting that education process? Then it has to be on the enforcement end too. So our local government officials, our inspectors, zoning folks, we all have to be multiple and often, especially in areas of high hazards that are increased susceptibility of these WUI fires.
What do you got, John? Anything?
I'm waiting for you.
Okay, good enough. Greg, I think you're right. It is a whole community approach. I think that we can't just rely on the fire department, the land managers and I'm talking about the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, Park Service, people who may operate private industry on the forest lands. We can't just leave it to them. It's got to be more than that. Everybody has a role in this, and I think specifically from the law enforcement side, it's well, that's a fire thing. We shouldn't be involved with this, and I think that it's not the right thing to do. The right approach. That there is a role for non-traditional responders, which would include humane services, animal services, emergency vet services, those with functional needs. Have we even thought about what happens if somebody can't move out or the caregiver is not there to bring the wheelchair or whatever it may be? We can't just see it as a fire department issue. It has to be greater than that. And taking the time to plan ahead, whether we're standing up a multi-agency coordination or an incident management team, or even just having a social hour and talking about where our roles cross and how we're going to work this out, that's a step in the right direction, rather than saying, this is just a fire issue, we'll deal with it then.
Yeah, and we spoke about this in the earlier sessions, is it's a unified approach, right? We use unified command. We know these incidents are going to be unified, managed by using unified command. But again, what we need to do is get on the front end of this thing, and that's a unified approach. And Greg, I like the fact that you're talking about, getting into schools, right? So I would go and talk to the kids at school, and one of the things during Fire Prevention Week would be, hey, go home, have your mom and dad test the smoke detector. Well, hey, what if you took, and I was showing you guys a little bit earlier, but there's a checklist that's in the Firewise. And what if you took that home and passed it out to the kids, say, hey, mom, dad, can we go through the checklist? I mean, it's at that level there where you can, you start them young, and it's something that they can keep. And hey, here's my checklist of things when it comes season. Have I addressed these things? Rat, you talked a little bit about people and the inability for people to get out. I think that when we start talking about, and we talked a little bit about evacuation before, is if I'm the neighbor and I know I have someone that's next door that's, let's say, elderly, and I can't, and they're not going to be able to evacuate, that needs to be part of my plan. How do I help them as well, and have them prepared? So that community, it's an all community approach on this. We talked after 9/11, we talked about see something, say something. Well, I think it's the same approach you could do as far as when looking at wildland. If you see that, hey, there's something going on with one of your neighbors, it seems to be some overgrowth, don't get in confrontation about them, but go over and say, hey, I noticed this. Can I help you? Can I get you right? There may be a reason why something's not getting done. And if you have those relationships before with your neighbors, it's not confrontational, and it's people helping people. And I think we need to get back to that.
That's a great point, John. And one of the things that really made me think about was the staffing shortages that our fire departments, our law enforcement agencies, and all public safety is facing of their departments and the call volumes seem to be going up and we're getting busier, but we don't have the amount of people, and we're taken away from our pub ed programs. So between Rat and yours comments of how can we become a more unified team? How can we help each other out? And that's kind of along the lines of getting them partnering with our school districts, our utility companies. Lots of people are doing grocery and food deliveries now, but putting flyers and educational. This has to be all hands on deck. We're all shorthanded, and there's nothing more timely than the present that we all join hands. We realize that this is an ever-growing problem and threat and hazard, and all of us together have to join hands and do a little something to help each other. And preparedness, if we can't prevent, we need to prepare.
I think that the new NIMS buzz phrase, right, is unity of effort. So I think you're right on with that. Ashley, here in California, we have a thing they call earthquake weather, right? When I don't even know what it is. We used to say it all the time. This is earthquake weather. No such thing. But you've been through a wildland fire up here in California, or perhaps anywhere, you can feel the humidity is lower. Maybe you smell smoke in the air from a smoke from a distant fire someplace. You just kind of know, you get that feeling. And especially if you have been through one before, you wake up that morning, go, this is not good. You keep the gas tank full in the car. You check on, where everyone's going to be. And I guess that's my point in this whole thing, is that if we are responders, if we are community members on a high fire danger day or a critical fire weather advisory red flag day, we should be thinking that. Some of the lessons that we've learned out of the Lahaina, Maui, the Dixie fire a couple of years back here in California, just because the fire is several miles off doesn't mean it's not going to spread to us. What we're seeing here in some of the forest canopies here, a fire will spread through the crown of the trees, the tops of the trees, and it's very difficult to put out because it's way up high in the canopy and it's just spreading, and it can go fast. Look what we saw here earlier this year, right, guys? In February, March, Texas, in the middle of winter, range fires, entire towns being surrounded, no way to get out because the fire's all over. So it's not, it happens to somebody else. If it's happening in your community, even if you have a couple of minutes or an hour's warning, take those precautions. It may be too late to do defensible space, but fuel up the tank. Get your kit together. Be ready to evacuate when the notification comes.
So, Rad, I have a question for you, maybe
Go ahead with the question.
for our listeners. Calling number 3. But when you look at red flag, if you look at a red flag day versus a regular day, what's the difference in the conditions?
Meteorologically speaking, or we're talking about staff?
Kind of both.
Okay.
You talk about humidity, you talk about some of those things, but just for some of the listeners that may not be aware.
Sure. So when we get critical fire weather, that may be it could be a period of days or even maybe a period of hours where the humidity drops to critical levels and perhaps wind speeds pick up. And it's a combination of meteorological conditions that would make fires spread or ignitions spread a lot quicker than they might if the relative humidity is higher. The lower the humidity, the greater the fuels start and spread, especially if you have winds. So that could, even in wintertime, you could have low RH levels and winds and have critical fire weather, even though it's cold outside. So the campfire, it was snowing that last couple of days of the campfire. I mean, it was coming into Christmas, it was snowing.
The reason why I ask that is because when you start looking again, these after action reports, and we had unfortunately the 19 firefighters that were killed here several years back in Arizona, was that I remember that day. I remember those conditions. The winds were high, the temps were high, and then the humidity was low. And a lot of these, what we're seeing now more in, like I said, in these more recent fires, is the speed of the movement of the fire itself, where and I made a few notes earlier today, but but they were, where you had 50-mile-an-hour winds, and in some places they were saying 80-mile-an-hour winds where the responders couldn't get their doors open. I mean, so you're talking about something that comes from and I hate to use the word normal, but a non-red flag day. The speed may be slower. Again, the conditions are different versus, and I think that's one of the things that people have to understand is that you don't get to pick the day of what type of day you're going to have. Is this going to be a red flag day, or is this going to be a normal day without those conditions? And so the ability to evacuate, to get out, I mean, that all gets reduced. I talked about before. I said that time is something that you can't change. It's a factor that you always have to think about. So, like I said, that's why I wanted to kind of just bring up the conditions of the red flag, what that really means, and how that can actually impact the response piece.
Greg, in where you are, do you actually have a fire season, like fire season?
Sort of, not as widely publicized, but it's usually after the spring snow melt with all the dead vegetation from the winter. But in these years where we didn't have a lot of snowfall, we not only had the spring season, but it's been dry again. And as a matter of fact, we're getting ready to enter a really unorthodox hot and dry spell. And so I think we're going to actually have another one in the upper northwest or Midwest here. And then fall, as the vegetation all starts to die off. If we don't get snowfall or have a wet fall, we also have those threats then.
Yeah.
And something to add on in the preparedness piece, because we live in an area that doesn't necessarily have these very large WUI fires, if you will, but we have smaller pockets now, and we have a lot of growth. And our county itself, the second fastest growing county in the state, we have that rural sprawl. And so we take lessons like the Texas fires, like any current event. We did it for the Tennessee fires in Gatlinburg, for Maui. And as they're wrapping up of what they're doing, we take that in our public education piece and say, hey, current events. Are you taking the opportunity as you're seeing this unfold, as you're hearing the stories of people didn't have enough time to get out, people weren't prepared, and are you taking that and here's a checklist? Are you doing this? Are you thinking about this? What's your evacuation route? What's the dead vegetation look like against your house? Are you prepared for the winter when you start your fireplace up? Is your chimney clean? How are you going to dispose of the debris? And so not that we're focused on the event that's occurring at somebody else's disadvantage, but I think we need to take advantage of that incident that's happening to kind of make it resonate with our folks that it can happen, it does happen, and it can happen here next.
Yeah, and then my question to ask you, that's great, is that fire season is relative. I know here in California, they monitor fuel moisture levels, and they say, okay, here's the start of fire season, but it gets earlier and earlier and goes later and later. So it's almost year round now. So when we talk about fire season, maybe Ashley, where you are, or John, where you are, it might be more definitive, but out here in the West, it's pretty much all year now.
Yeah, I mean, we had one that just started yesterday or day before up in Wickenburg area. I saw they started letting people back in. I mean, we've had several already this year, so it's pretty much year round for us. Ashley, you'd asked about the role of emergency services in local governments, and I know we talked a lot about the fire departments and police departments, but it is really that partnership where the local government has to plays a key role in this, and because we can send out fire units, we can send out police units, the forestry folks, but it really is an all that unified approach, and so some of the things that I was thinking about, again, looking at some of these past instances, making sure that there's mutual aid agreements, not just between the fire agencies and police agencies, but between communities. What can we share? How do we get that? How do we communicate? Redundancies in systems. So we talked a little bit about communications. Can I utilize a neighboring community's, let's say, dispatch center or radio frequencies and channels if something happens to our critical infrastructure. So are there plans in place to work with neighboring communities as far as in that having those private partner those private sector partnerships, right, is key because I gave you that little story about the little snowfall thing that we had. Well, we had to go hire a person to have something in place there where you already have contracts in place, because Greg can attest to this. When you bring in private sector partnerships, they want to be paid. And if you have that stuff in the front end of this, it makes it a lot easier, because now it's those resources that maybe the fire service doesn't have or the police agencies don't have, but those, how do I get those private sector units, right? Excavators, things of that nature. How do I get that in the 11th hour? Pre-planning, moving when on those red flag days, moving units into more forward positions rather than at their fire stations, right? So moving those into tactical positions. And so I think there's a lot of different things that that preparedness piece and the communities and response. And again, we talked about it in both sessions, is it's really about looking those after action reports and lessons learned. We shouldn't be learning those same lessons on our incident if others have already encountered this. We should be taking those and utilizing those as part of the preparedness piece.
Yeah, I just a couple final thoughts, guys. I mean, we've talked about quite a few things here, but I'm seeing preparedness and partnerships is really key in responding to be prepared for the Louis fire situation. So those are my two big takeaways.
John, I think you took the words out of everyone's mouth, and that was a great summation to everything we've been talking about here today. And, here's the only thing I'll add at the end: relationships matter. And the more that we're building relationships with the citizens and visitors in our area and using prevention and education piece, the more that we can prevent and also prevent injuries and deaths when these fires do occur.
I think what's happened historically is we work in silos, right? Police does police stuff and fire does fire stuff. And I mentioned before, for the city of Phoenix, we have automatic aid, so we respond to help our neighbors on a daily basis. And as we've moved more north, what's happened is we are running more with agencies that have more the Wildland or the Louis situation. So one of the things that's happened to us about probably 5 or 6 years ago was really partnering with like Arizona Department of Transportation, working with Southwest Gas, or SRP, our power companies, the different agencies, but working with Bureau of Land Management. These are all things that those partnerships, relationships, like you said, Greg, doing on their front end. And our responses look so much different today than it did, 7-8 years ago. Because of the folks that have put the time in here locally to build those systems in place and build those partnerships and those relationships. So when these events occur, that we know each other. There's the people that are running this. They know each other. They know who to make those phone calls to and how to contact them. And it's a unified approach.
Thank you so much. That about wraps up our series. Thank you so much to Greg, John, and Andrew for joining us for this series, and hopefully if you have any questions or topic suggestions for future episodes, please send us an email at podcast@ncbrt.lsu.edu. Make sure you subscribe to the LSU NCBRT Preparedness podcast wherever you listen to podcasts.